Sometimes it's easier to talk about what is it that we wake up out of, what is it that we wake up from when we have these shifts at the identity level that are generally called awakening, these perceptual shifts. Because awakening in itself, it's almost impossible to describe, and all the words at best can only point towards something that is purely non-conceptual and experiential and fully embodied and viscerally felt. So it's really beyond the mind's capacity to understand or grasp in any possible manner. So I thought I would make a video to talk a little bit about that particular condition of human development. Okay, that seems to be some sort of evolutionary phase that we go through, like being born as humans and in human bodies, which is that we develop self-awareness, which then develops further into state of separation, right? State of existential separation that is felt at the level of the mind and heart and gut. So it's a very immersive experience. Because we did not inhabit this condition when we were children, okay? So the memories from the childhood can be vague, of course, but I think all of us can, to a certain extent, access kind of flashes, or kind of experiential kind of images, impressions from the childhood that was somehow very different than the form of separation and mind identification and kind of existential angst and unease that we eventually just somehow find ourselves in. So what is this mind identification? It's very hard to explain. It's like actually such a complex phenomena, like the experience of separation, the experience of self. Because reality, like direct reality, this immediate non-conceptual way of experiencing yourself and the world, which is called awakening, that's radically simple. So what is extremely complex is what manages to apparently hide it or conceal it, like, and I was saying earlier that it's very immersive experience, because it's not just the level of the mind, it's not just a cognitive illusion or optical illusion. It's felt very energetically, right? It's felt very physically. So it's almost impossible to explain what it is, but this is my my attempt today to talk about it a little bit. Well, just like with everything, we can kind of only see something for what it was when it's no longer there, okay? At least in my experience, this applies to almost everything. We can only see a self-delusion when it dissolves or drops. Then only then we can see it for what it was, right? Or a fixation. We can only see a form of awakening for what it was when it releases, drops, shifts into, you could say, another aspect of awakening or a deepening or when our investigation proceeds further. So we can only see a relationship usually for what it was when it's not there anymore, when it's ended and the experience has been more or less integrated. I think only then we can really sense, oh, that's what it was. That's what that relationship was. Not as a story or narrative. You can never really fix anything. You can never really say anything about anything, so that applies to relationships as well. But I think there's some truth to it, that we can only really see something for what it is when it's not there anymore. So going back to the subject that I started to talk about, which is mind identification. Another word for it could be egoic consciousness. And the term ego is, of course, a little bit tricky because it can be used in so many ways. It can mean so many different things to different people, and depending on the person speaking. But the way I'm using it here is to describe a specific form of consciousness that almost has a life of its own, okay? Which is characterized by constant self-obsession, this constant turning within and looking within and being kind of concerned and obsessed about one's experience. Which is interesting because when we get into spirituality and awakening and self-inquiry and all of that, that almost just seems to be another form of a kind of self-obsession. I mean, if it works, it eventually liberates this whole inwards turning movement of self that is constantly looking within and kind of concerned about its own bubble that it's creating. So it's a kind of like a bubble, that egoic consciousness, but when we are in it, it feels like normal. It feels normal to be living in a bubble where maturity of our energy and time and attention goes into thoughts about ourselves, basically. And most of our activity is also oriented towards our own happiness, and avoiding pain and getting what we want. And most of our interactions in relationships are all about, what can I get from it? How does this benefit me? And so on. So yeah, self-absorption is a good name for it, and this would be more at the level of the mind, how it feels like, how it functions. It also comes with this phenomenon of a commentator. Okay, so many people experience the kind of voice in their head, which is constantly kind of narrating or commenting what's happening, constantly, and you just can't turn it off. And it's so disturbing and annoying and borderline painful to be all the time kind of tortured by this inner voice that somehow appears as if it's yours, but at the same time you have no control over it, and it doesn't really do anything other than creates suffering for yourself and others around you, others around you, in a sense, if you start to react to the inner voice and believe what it says and so on. And it can kind of create disturbances in relationships and in connection and so on. So that's one of the effects that the ego comes with at the level of the mind. And it's very interesting that even though there is this constant looking within, constant obsession about my experience, how the experience is, what's happening, how does this feel like, and it's never quite right, when we are in egoic consciousness, it always feels like, something is a little bit off, or sometimes it's very obvious, that sensation that something is really off, and this constant attempt to try to fix it. There's this constant sense of craving at the core of the egoic consciousness, like this kind of experience of lacking, like something fundamental is really lagging, but I can't really say what it is. And but it's very uncomfortable sensation, which then, if it's unconscious, then usually it directs itself into external seeking, that we start to seek from the missing piece from outside, in various ways. So this sense of inner lack is very characteristic to the egoic consciousness, that when we turn within, that's what we kind of encounter. So even there is this inwards turning movement, it never actually, there's actually not real intimacy with the experience, because we kind of meet that uncomfortable sense of and vague sense of lack, and we kind of meet that internal conflict and division, and angst and insecurity. And instead of feeling that directly, it's almost like the whole egoic consciousness is just kind of looping around, like it, instead of actually encountering the experience as it is, it gets entangled then with the thoughts and images and stories about like what's going on. And that whole movie then feels like our life, or feels like what we are, and feels like what other people are. So it's this very bizarre entanglement of narratives and images and thoughts and the commentator with these sensations, like raw sensations that we are kind of dissociated due to the identification to the images and narratives. There's also usually like a constant sense of a struggle, more or less. This constant sense of like, I need to kind of do something. I need to do something about myself. I need to do something about my life. I need to somehow manage reality. I need to manage my experience. I need to manage others. Another name for that could be control. Okay, there's tremendous resistance for directly, like viscerally, at the level of the body, to just feeling the reality as it is. For some reason, there's tremendous resistance, and that's very characteristic for the experience of egoic consciousness. Like it's mainly a massive kind of dissociation, we could say, from the direct sense experience due to habit and conditioning. So like no one would ever choose that. We just kind of find ourselves in it, and then it's almost like we get pulled deeper and deeper into it, into the entanglement, without knowing what's happening and without anyone giving us any kind of understanding about what's happening, because everyone is in it, like most people in our society. So it's considered normal, it's considered normal to constantly hear a voice in your head that is self-critical, that is self-judgmental, or that judges others, that it's considered normal to be living in this mind-created reality, which is mistaken to be like real, like real in a sense that, well, what is real? Well, that's another question. But yeah, when that the inherent reality of that mind world is unquestioned and unexamined, it's a very solidified experience. Okay, it's like it's very contracted experience, and again, we don't realize how contracted it is until it releases. Okay, only when it's not there you can kind of feel it for what it was, but it's kind of like you would hold a fist really tight like this, and then at some point it's just, there's this opening, it just opens, and then you feel, oh my god, it's just not here anymore, that existential contraction. And at the core of it, you can then sense that, oh, it was just fear. It was just contraction out of fear, resistance out of fear, control out of fear. But no one is doing it, so it's this experience of personal self. It's very impersonal, like that. It's not done by anyone. It's a kind of doing, but it's not done by you, because that is you if you experience yourself as a separate, solid, fixed entity, as a person. Like, it is really nothing other than this entanglement, this contracted entanglement, what I was just trying to describe here. There's no you there other than just these sensations in the body that gets entangled, with the mind, with the thoughts, with the narratives that kind of co-create this type of very bizarre form of self-consciousness, which is such a bubble. It's really a bubble. There's no any real connection, like real intimacy with reality or with others. There's no real meeting. Like, you don't really see others. The others in this mode are really nothing other than purely projection of your own unconsciousness. But you actually imagine you see others. It's crazy like that. Like, so it's a very bizarre condition that for some reason the human evolution is taking us through this type of self-consciousness. And when that then begins to release, okay, and it's very mysterious, like why is it even there in the first place? Like, I often get this question from people, like, why is the separation, why do we have to go through that, and then why awakening? And it's just interesting, because reality is actually acausal from this, you'd say, liberated perspective. So the whole experience of separation is acausal. It's just kind of dreamlike. It's spontaneously appearing, but it's not caused by anything, actually. It's totally baseless and groundless, like that. And then this experience of natural state or awakening or realization, which is really nothing other than an antidote to this illness, okay, of mind identification. That's also acausal, that's also spontaneous, that's also very dreamlike, and you can't really locate the beginning of it. Just like you can't really locate the beginning of a state of separation, because it's not actually there in a way we think it is. It doesn't have any inherent reality, even it feels so real. Just like awakening doesn't have any inherent reality. And that can also feel very, very real. It feels more real than real compared to the mind identification. But when you go all the way through with this process, then this whole distinction between real and unreal collapses, and you really, it's like you wake up from the awakening. and it's a whole subject of its own that I'm not going to go now, but I want to talk a little bit about what happens when this existential contraction first starts to release, because usually it first starts to release at the level of the mind for most people, but not for everyone. It can also start to release at the level of the heart or gut, in which case the experience can be very bewildering and even confusing. Okay, it's like almost impossible to describe it, because if at the level of the mind you still haven't seen through, the self, the experience of separation, but then physically you start to, open up to the boundlessness and formlessness. Yeah, so that can be very strange. That's how it actually happened for me initially. But for most people, they start to open up at the level of the mind, and that's when we get into non-duality and we hear all these pointers, like, hey, question your thoughts. Like, it's possible to disentangle yourself from mind identification, right? So, and there's various ways how to go about this, you know, meditation practices and inquiry practices and so on. Or it can just start to happen spontaneously on its own, or through some sort of life circumstances that really challenges your habitual way of thinking and perceiving and interpreting reality. But it can even happen sometimes through therapeutic work if it's really skillful. You know, skillful, I mean that it doesn't deepen the mind identification and solidify the identity even more, but it's actually releasing that condition. So we can then, at the level of the mind, start to see through, oh, that's what the ego is. Like, oh, that's what it is. And I am not it. Like, what I am is actually something much more profound and unknowable and alive, you know, mysterious, and this whole ego starts to appear more like, that is some sort of aspect, you know, of my psychology, and it's still there, but I can kind of see through it. I can detach from it. I can question it, you know, question its reality, and I can more and more start to access that there is just this natural presence to my beingness, which has always been there, which was there when I was a child, and that you kind of start to wake up from that identification to the mind and to the ego in that type of way, that the natural presence of what you are, it simply starts to shine in the experience. So this is sometimes called first awakening, if this perceptual shift is abiding, you know, not just an experience, but abiding, and it really transforms the way you experience your everyday life and your relationship with others in a way that this bubble, you know, it really starts to expand, that it's, your life is not anymore just about me, you know, like what I want, what I don't want, and you know, self-concern, self-obsession and so on, but it genuinely, you know, begins to expand. And this is, again, very tricky thing to talk about, because the ego can very well imagine, you know, that it's expanding. It can take these kind of elevated forms, and which is sometimes called spiritual ego. So this ego is so intelligent in certain ways, so it can learn all these things, and then it can start to imitate all of that. You know, it can suddenly start to become, oh, I'm very other oriented, I'm very altruistic, I'm very compassionate, I'm very detached, I'm not reactive, and so on and so on, and I'm very self-aware. That's when people start to have this really bizarre self-awareness to kind of signal that, you know, that they have some sort of spiritual thing going on there. So the ego can do all of that. So that's why it's so hard, again, to understand what's going on until it really starts to collapse, you know, that whole form of egoic consciousness, and you really genuinely start to live from this place of natural presence. And there's some sort of experiential kind of signs that you can check in with yourself, like if it's genuine. And one of them is that it doesn't need any external validation when this shift starts to occur or has occurred. It really doesn't need that. That's one of the hallmarks of egoic consciousness, that it's constantly needing for assurance and validation and approval. But when these natural shifts occurs, I mean, if it comes with a lot of experiential byproducts, sometimes we might need some assurance, you know, that it's okay, you know, that we can trust this transformative process. But fundamentally, when it really starts to stabilize, you know, you don't need to necessarily tell others about it, or there's not this need that others need to wake up to and discover this. And this is all really common to go through this type of phase, when it's really important that we need to tell everyone about this new discovery, that there is such a thing as awakening and everyone should wake up and so on. But when this really, really deep and thorough shift at the identity level occurs, all of this just somehow ceases in such a radical way. You're just so immersed, in direct immediacy that those kind of questions don't even arise almost, and of course, sometimes you may end up speaking about these things, but it's kind of different whether it's coming from that place of, oh, I had this experience, or I had this shift, and now I need to tell everyone about it, or you're, communicating from, from a very different place of openness and authenticity, honesty, curiosity, willingness to keep looking very close to the experience, to continue with the process. So the first awakening usually happens, we could say, at the level of the mind. So even it's a disidentification from the narratives and the narrative cells into this, we could say it's just pure reflection, okay? Instead of very fixating reflection about reality and about ourselves that is contracted around the narratives, we start to access this boundless consciousness, almost like pure formless mind, which feels very liberating. But it's still at the level of the mind that, in a sense, that this realization has not necessarily yet been at all realized at the level of the body, at the level of the heart, and at the level of the gut, because that's a whole process of its own, which is a lot more even strange and mysterious than the awakening at the level of the mind, which, by the way, is extremely radical when it's taken all the way through. Like the initial awakening at the level of the mind is usually just a small taste of this total annihilation of reality that takes place when all these fundamental beliefs about self and reality, fundamental beliefs, like time and space and location and continuity and substance and solidity and all of these. So when these are released, it's literally the end of your world. It's the end of your world. It's such a radical destruction. But at the level of the heart and gut, it's radical in a sense that it becomes harder and harder to describe in words, because it's almost like this organic, energetic process that starts to take place there. And I think it's one of the pitfalls that if we have this awakening at the level of the mind, we don't actually see how much the egoic consciousness is still there and functioning, as a kind of personal will and doer and controller, and all the emotions, all the shadow work that is perhaps not done at all. So all of that stuff in the body might kind of go to the background, and then on the foreground there is this very expansive awareness, pure awareness, and our identity is not taking the form of that. So it's very interesting that in this particular phase it can be very easy to overlook that this what is actually happening in the body. So it's very interesting how much of that egoic contraction and kind of pockets of that type of egoic consciousness can still live in the body, in the embodied experience, even though at the conscious level there is this disidentification from narratives and identification as simply presence or awareness or consciousness. It's surprising also how hidden it can be for someone who is in this particular phase of awakening. So this is where the shadow work obviously comes in, and why it is now more emphasized, luckily, in the non-dual circles, because it's only through thorough emotional work and shadow work that this realization can really embody itself and kind of explore itself viscerally, through the instrument of the body, through your heart and gut. So there is this profound heart opening and this release at the gut level, which is very, very different type of release than the disidentification that happens at the level of the mind. And I'm not going to go more into that. I think I could make a whole video about just the heart level awakening and the gut level awakening. But I will say that they are really, really what brings this very effortless and very embodied, moment by moment realization of emptiness and luminosity and radiance and aliveness and the kaleidoscopic flux, the non-fixating nature of reality. It's absolutely indescribable when your body starts to open up to that, and these resistance patterns that are in the body, they start to release, they start to dissolve, and you really, really start to feel how it feels like, that there is just this incredible lightness and weightlessness and natural state of flow and simplicity and incredible richness, and that the narrator is not there, and even if thoughts appear, they don't anymore, the experience of reality is not anymore gravitated around the thoughts, but thought becomes almost like a transparent sense of its own, like transparent vibrancy of its own, so nothing needs to be repressed in this experience. Nothing needs to be rejected or avoided. Nothing needs to even to be accepted, because you see that there is nothing or no one here that could be doing any of that could be arguing with reality or managing with reality. Like, that's what all of that actually was. Like, all of that self-contraction, all of the egoic consciousness, all of the very narrow and fixed identification into particular views and perspectives and opinions, that all of it was really nothing other than deeply rooted resistance to the natural sense immediacy of what is. So that's what we wake up to, so to speak, if that's even the word for it, because it's not an identity. It's not an identity. It's not a new identity that replaces the old egoic identity. It's more like that this existential illness, this existential contractedness, it just naturally finds a way to unwind itself, in a very embodied and energetic manner, in a very physical manner, in a very biological manner. And then this natural state, it just shines, but not only that, because it's a dynamic condition and it has this quality of spontaneity, which now we can actually start to explore, which was previously blocked by this fixed and solidified, way of experiencing yourself and reality, through grasping and holding on and resisting and pushing and pulling. So that's why calling this awakening can be misleading, because you kind of see that reality is always awake. It's innately awake. So it feels like awakening when it's happening, this dissolution of the contracted states. But what eventually reveals itself is that which always has been, which is simply the case, which can never be but what it is, and there's no words for it. It is unspeakable, but that's what it's sometimes called, awakening.